The shadow on the trail. Lisa loved jogging. It was her way of clearing her mind and staying fit. Every morning she tied her running shoes and set out on the old forest trail near her house. This trail was her favorite place. It was quiet and peaceful, with tall trees that stretched high into the sky and birds singing sweet melodies. The soft crunch of dirt under her feet and the cool breeze always made her feel calm. She liked how the sunlight peeped through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on the ground. This trail felt like her little escape from the busy world. One chilly morning, just before dawn, Lisa got ready for her jog as usual. She put on her favorite hoodie, zipped it up to her chin, and stepped outside. The cold air stung her face, but she didn't mind. She loved the crisp freshness of early mornings. The streets were quiet, and the world seemed to be still asleep. As she approached the trail, a faint mist hung in the air, giving the forest an almost magical look. Lisa started her jog at a steady pace. The trail was familiar, and she felt safe here. As she ran, her breath puffed out in small white clouds. She was enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest when she noticed something strange. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow. At first, she thought it was nothing, just the movement of the trees swaying or the sunlight shifting. But as she kept running, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadow wasn't like the other shadows of the trees or bushes. It seemed to move when she moved. It stayed just behind her, following her pace. Lisa tried to ignore it. It's probably just my imagination, she told herself. Maybe it's a trick of the light. She focused on the trail ahead, but her heart began to race faster, and not because of the jogging. The more she ran, the more certain she became that the shadow was following her. She glanced back quickly but saw nothing. Her eyes darted around, scanning the trees and bushes, but everything looked normal. I'm being silly, she thought, shaking her head. There's nothing there, but deep down she felt uneasy. Lisa decided to pick up her pace. She wasn't ready to stop her jog, but she wanted to shake off this strange feeling. Her feet pounded the ground harder as she sped up, yet the shadow seemed to match her speed. No matter how fast she ran, it stayed with her. She could feel her chest tighten with fear. Her breaths came quicker now, not from running but from the growing panic inside her. Suddenly she heard a sound. It was low and guttural, like a growl. Lisa froze in her tracks. Her body stiffened, and her mind raced. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in her ears. At first she saw nothing, but then, in the dim light of the early morning, she spotted a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the underbrush. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The eyes were unnaturally bright, almost like they were lit from within. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It looked like a man, but there was something horribly wrong with his appearance. His face was pale and twisted, with features that didn't seem quite human. His movements were jerky and unnatural, as if he wasn't used to walking. Panic took over. Lisa let out a scream and turned to run. Her feet flew over the trail as fast as they could carry her. She didn't dare look back. Her only thought was to reach the trailhead and get to her car. The trees blurred past her as she pushed herself to run faster than she ever had before. The forest seemed darker now, and every sound made her flinch. Was he following her? She couldn't hear footsteps, but she didn't want to slow down to find out. Finally, the trailhead came into view. Her car was parked just a few feet away. She sprinted the last stretch, her lungs burning and her legs feeling like jelly. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly that she almost dropped them. Somehow, she managed to unlock the door, jump in, and slam it shut. She locked the doors and sat there, gasping for air. After a moment, she dared to look back at the trail. It was empty. The man, or whatever it was gone. The glowing eyes, the twisted face, the shadow, it had all vanished. The forest looked calm and peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. Lisa stayed in her car for a long time, trying to calm down. When she finally felt steady enough to drive, she went straight to the police station. She told them everything, every detail about what she had seen and experienced. The officer who took her report listened carefully, his face serious. When she finished, he told her something that made her blood run cold. That area has a history of strange disappearances, he said. You're lucky you got out of there. Lisa didn't know what to say. She nodded and left the station, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had come dangerously close to something terrible. From that day on, she never jogged on the forest trail again. Even the thought of it made her heart pound. The trail, once her peaceful escape, had become a place of fear and mystery. But sometimes late at night, Lisa would lie awake in bed, replaying the events in her mind. She would wonder what the shadow was and why it had followed her. She would think about the glowing eyes and the twisted face. Was it real, or was it something her mind had created in the dim light of dawn? No matter how much she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the fear lingered. As weeks turned into months, Lisa found new places to jog. Parks, sidewalks, and well-lit streets became her new routine. But the memory of that morning stayed with her. She avoided the forest trail completely, even in broad daylight. Every time she passed by it, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if the trail itself held a dark secret, one that she had narrowly escaped. One day, Lisa decided to do some research. She wanted to know more about the strange disappearances the police officer had mentioned. She spent hours at the library and on the internet, reading old newspaper articles and digging through local history. What she found only deepened her fear. The forest trail had a dark past. Years ago, several people had gone missing in that area. Most were hikers or joggers, just like Lisa. In some cases, their belongings were found: a backpack, a shoe, a phone, but the people themselves were never seen again. The disappearances were mysterious, with no clear explanation. Some locals believed the forest was haunted, while others thought there was something more sinister lurking in the woods. Lisa's hands trembled as she read the stories. She realized how close she had been to becoming one of those missing people. The thought made her feel sick. She couldn't stop thinking about the glowing eyes and the shadow that had followed her. What if it had been waiting for her? What if she hadn't run fast enough? Despite her fear, Lisa couldn't let it go. She felt like she needed answers, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. She considered going back to the trail, but the thought terrified her. She decided to talk to some of the older residents in town, hoping they might know more about the forest's history. One afternoon, Lisa visited an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, who had lived in the town her whole life. Mrs. Carter welcomed Lisa warmly and listened as she explained her experience. When Lisa mentioned the shadow and the glowing eyes, Mrs. Carter's face grew serious. "You're not the first to see it," Mrs. Carter said in a hushed voice. "People have talked about strange things in that forest for years. Shadows that move on their own, eyes watching you from the trees. Some say it's the spirit of a man who disappeared long ago. Others think it's something darker, something not human." Lisa's heart sank. Hearing someone else confirm her fears made it all feel even more real. She thanked Mrs. Carter and left, her mind racing. She realized that whatever was in the forest, it wasn't something she could explain or understand. All she knew was that she had been lucky to escape. From that day on, Lisa made a promise to herself. She would stay away from the forest trail and focus on living her life. But no matter how much time passed, the memory of that morning stayed with her. It was a reminder of the unknown and the shadow that had come too close. The Silent Pursuer expanded version. Tom loved running. It gave him a sense of freedom and peace, especially late at night when the world seemed to slow down. He was training for his first marathon, and his suburban neighborhood, with its quiet streets and minimal traffic, was the perfect place for his nightly jogs. The streets were lined with streetlights casting a soft glow, and the occasional chirping of crickets added to the serene atmosphere. Tom always felt safe in his neighborhood. After all, nothing ever happened there, or so he thought. One evening, as Tom laced up his running shoes, he felt an unusual chill in the air. It wasn't cold, but there was something different about the night. Dismissing the feeling, he grabbed his water bottle and headed out the door. The first mile was uneventful. He passed the familiar houses with their neatly trimmed lawns, some still lit with warm, inviting lights. Others were dark, their occupants already fast asleep. As Tom approached the park at the edge of the neighborhood, he slowed his pace slightly. The park was a common part of his route, a small, open area with a playground and a few benches scattered around. Normally he found it calming, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed darker, and the usual hum of insects and rustling leaves was strangely muted. Tom shook his head, laughing at himself. "Stop being silly," he muttered under his breath. He continued running, but as he passed the park, he felt a strange sensation. It was subtle at first, like the faintest tickle on the back of his neck. It felt as though someone was behind him, running at the same pace. Tom glanced over his shoulder, but the street was empty. The feeling lingered, though, making the hair on his arms stand on end. Trying to shake it off, Tom focused on his breathing and the rhythm of his steps. Left, right, left, right. The sound of his sneakers hitting the pavement was steady, almost comforting. But then he heard another set of footsteps. Faint but unmistakable, they matched his pace perfectly. He stopped abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. The other footsteps stopped too. Tom spun around, his eyes scanning the empty street. There was no one there. The park behind him was quiet, the playground empty. The houses ahead were still, their windows dark. He took a deep breath and let out a nervous laugh. "Maybe I'm just tired," he told himself. Determined not to let his imagination get the better of him, Tom resumed his run. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. The sound of footsteps returned, louder now, as if there was a person was getting closer. Tom's chest tightened with fear. He quickened his pace, hoping to lose whatever was following him. The footsteps quickened too. Tom's mind raced. Should he stop again? Should he call for help? His phone was in his pocket, but the thought of stopping to use it made him feel vulnerable. Instead, he decided to take a detour. He turned sharply onto a side street, one he didn't usually take. It was darker here, with fewer streetlights and more trees casting long, eerie shadows. The footsteps followed. By now, Tom's breathing was ragged. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears. And he heard something new breathing, heavy, raspy breathing coming from just behind him. Panic surged through him, and he broke into an all-out sprint. The world around him blurred as he focused on one thing: getting home. When Tom finally reached his house, he practically threw himself at the front door. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his keys. The breathing seemed closer now, as if the person was right next to him. Finally, the key slid into the lock, and he pushed the door open. He slammed it shut behind him and locked it, leaning against the door as he tried to catch his breath. The house was silent, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He peeked out the window, but the street was empty. Still, he felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. That night, he barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made him jump. The next morning, Tom woke up feeling groggy but slightly more rational. It was probably just my imagination, he told himself. To prove it, he decided to check his front porch. Maybe he'd find evidence that it was all in his head. But when he opened the door, his blood ran cold. There, on the doorstep, was a single muddy footprint. It was far too large to be his own. Over the next few days, Tom tried to convince himself it was a prank. Maybe some neighborhood kid had followed him as a joke, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He couldn't explain the footsteps, the breathing, or the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Tom avoided running at night after that. Instead, he started jogging in the mornings when the streets were alive with activity and the sun was shining. At first, it helped. The familiar sounds of birds chirping and people going about their day made him feel safe. But the feeling of unease never completely went away. He couldn't shake the memory of that night. One morning, about a week after the incident, Tom noticed something strange. As he jogged past the park, he saw a figure standing near the playground. It was too far away to make out any details, but the person was tall and motionless, almost like a statue. Tom's pace slowed as he tried to get a better look, but as soon as he turned his head fully, the figure was gone. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or a shadow playing tricks on his eyes. But as the days went on, he started noticing more strange occurrences. Small things. At first, a door that he was sure he had locked would be slightly ajar, or an object in his house would be out of place. Then there were the footprints. Every morning he'd find a new one on his porch, each time in a different position. It was as if someone was standing there, staring at his door. Tom's anxiety grew. He started sleeping with all the lights on, but it didn't help. He felt trapped in his own home, too afraid to leave after dark. He even considered installing cameras around his property, but deep down he wasn't sure he wanted to see what they might capture. A week later, Tom made the decision to move. He couldn't live like this anymore. He found an apartment in the city, far from the suburban streets that now felt haunted. Packing his things, he felt a sense of relief. Soon he'd be gone, and whatever was happening would be behind him. On his last night in the house, Tom couldn't sleep. The house was eerily quiet, and the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off. When he woke up, it was still dark, and the house felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was wrong. As he sat up in bed, he heard the faint sound of breathing. Not outside this time, but inside the house. Tom froze. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside his bedroom door. He reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but Tom could barely form a coherent sentence. "Someone's in my house," he whispered. He stayed on the line, clutching the phone like a lifeline, as he listened to the breathing. It didn't move closer, but it didn't go away either. When the police arrived, the sound stopped. They searched the house but found no one. The doors and windows were all locked, with no signs of forced entry. Tom left the neighborhood the next day. Months later, in his new apartment, Tom finally started to feel like himself again. The city was noisy and crowded, a stark contrast to the quiet suburb he'd left behind. But he found the chaos comforting. He no longer felt alone, no longer felt watched. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, he glanced out the window. The street below was bustling with life, people walking, cars honking. And then he saw it. A figure standing under a streetlight, tall and motionless. He was too far away to make out any details, but Tom's heart sank. He closed the curtains and turned off the lights, his hands trembling. The sense of safety he'd found in the city vanished in an instant. He knew, deep down, that he'd never truly escaped. The whistling man. Every Saturday morning, Sarah loved to run along the lakeside path in her town. The path stretched for miles, circling a large, serene lake surrounded by tall trees. Ducks glided peacefully across the water, their soft quacks mixing with the sound of gentle waves. Families often sat on picnic blankets on the grassy shore, kids laughing as they fed bread to the ducks. For Sarah, this place was her escape, a slice of tranquility in her otherwise busy life. But one Saturday morning was different. The air was heavy with fog, and the usual cheerful chatter of the lakeside was muted. The fog clung to the trees and hovered over the water, giving the place an eerie stillness. Sarah set off on her usual route, her sneakers crunching on the gravel path. She liked the quiet, but this morning it felt almost too quiet. Even the ducks seemed subdued, their forms barely visible through the mist. As she approached a bend in the trail, she heard something unusual whistling. It was faint at first, but as she jogged closer, the sound grew clearer. The tune was cheerful, a lively melody that seemed out of place in the foggy stillness. But there was something about it that made Sarah uneasy. It echoed in the mist, making it hard to tell where it was coming from. Sarah slowed her pace and glanced around. She saw no one. The whistling continued, growing louder with each step. She felt her heart quicken, unsure whether it was from her run or the strange sound. Then, out of the fog, a man appeared. He was walking toward her, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His coat was long and dark, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. The man's whistling paused as he noticed her. He stood still, blocking her path, and tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "Lovely morning for a run," he said, his voice low and cold. Sarah nodded nervously, unsure of what to say. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her. The man's whistling resumed, the cheerful tune now feeling more menacing. He took a step toward her, and Sarah's instinct screamed at her to run. Without a second thought, she turned and sprinted back the way she came. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her chest heaving as she slammed the door shut and locked it. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind. His old-fashioned clothes, his shadowed face, the way his whistling had echoed through the mist, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. She tried to tell herself it was just a strange encounter, maybe a local eccentric enjoying a morning walk. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Over the next week, Sarah found herself thinking about the man constantly. She told her best friend, Emma, about the encounter, hoping to make sense of it. "That's so creepy," Emma said, her eyes wide. "Did you tell anyone else?" Sarah shook her head. "I didn't know what to say. He didn't do anything, really. Just stood there and whistled." Emma frowned. "Still, it's weird. Maybe you should avoid that trail for a while." Sarah nodded, but part of her didn't want to avoid the trail. She loved running by the lake. It was her routine, her solace. She decided to go back the following Saturday, though she promised herself she'd be extra cautious. The morning of her next run was clear and sunny, a stark contrast to the foggy day before. Families were back on the grass, and the sound of kids playing filled the air. Sarah felt a little braver as she started her jog. The path was busy with other runners and walkers, and she reassured herself that the strange man wouldn't return. But as she approached the bend in the trail where she had seen him, her heart began to race. She slowed her pace, scanning the area. The trail was empty, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She let out a relieved breath and continued running. Maybe it had all been a one-time thing. Just as she rounded the bend, the whistling started again. Sarah froze. The tune was the same, cheerful, echoing, and out of place. Her chest tightened as she turned slowly, scanning the trees. The fog wasn't there this time, but the whistling still seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She didn't see anyone, but the sound grew louder, closer. Her legs felt rooted to the ground, her instincts screaming at her to move, but she couldn't. "Hey, are you okay?" a voice called. Sarah whipped around to see another runner, a middle-aged man in a bright yellow shirt, jogging toward her. The whistling stopped abruptly. Sarah let out a shaky breath, grateful for the interruption. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered. "Just thought I heard something." The man nodded, giving her a concerned look. "Be careful out here. There's been some weird stuff happening lately." "What kind of weird stuff?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. The man hesitated, then shrugged. I've just heard stories, people seeing things, strange noises. Could be nothing, but better safe than sorry. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She thanked the man and finished her run, though she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. That evening, she decided to do some research. She searched online for anything about strange sightings or sounds near the lake. Most of what she found was old news stories of drownings, urban legends, and vague accounts of ghostly figures seen in the fog. One story caught her attention: a man who had drowned in the lake years ago while jogging. Witnesses claimed he had been whistling moments before he disappeared beneath the water. Sarah's stomach turned as she read. Could it be the same man? The description matched old-fashioned clothes, a wide-brimmed hat, and that eerie whistling. She tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The following week, Sarah decided to go back to the trail, but this time she brought Emma with her. Emma was skeptical about the whole thing but agreed to come along for support. The morning was cloudy, with a light drizzle misting the air. The trail was quieter than usual, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She and Emma walked together, their conversation light and casual at first. But as they neared the bend in the trail, Sarah grew tense. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, glancing around. "It's just a path, Sarah. There's nothing here." But then they heard it. The whistling. It started faintly, then grew louder, the cheerful tune cutting through the drizzle. Emma's eyes widened and Sarah felt her stomach drop. The sound seemed to come from the trees, but when they looked, there was no one there. "Let's go," Emma said, grabbing Sarah's arm. They turned and hurried back the way they came, the whistling following them until they were out of earshot. That night, Sarah and Emma couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Emma, who had been a skeptic, was now convinced there was something supernatural about the man. They decided to dig deeper into the local legends, hoping to find answers. Over the next few weeks, they uncovered more stories about the whistling man. Some people claimed to have seen him standing on the lake's edge, staring into the water. Others said they'd heard his whistling late at night, long after the park was closed. And then there were the rumors about the jogger who had drowned, a man who, according to old news reports, had been known for always whistling while he ran. The more they learned, the more Sarah felt a strange connection to the man. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like he was trying to tell her something. Emma thought she was crazy for wanting to go back to the trail, but Sarah couldn't resist the pull. One foggy Saturday morning, Sarah returned to the lake alone. She walked slowly along the path, her ears straining for the sound of whistling. She didn't have to wait long. The tune started faintly, growing louder as she approached the bend. This time she didn't run. She stood her ground, her heart pounding as the man emerged from the fog. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head, his shadowed face unreadable. "This is my place," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was a sadness to it that made Sarah's chest ache. "What do you want?" she asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the lake, his whistling filling the air. Sarah hesitated, then followed him. When they reached the water's edge, the man stopped and pointed to the lake. "It's all there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked into the water, but all she saw was her own reflection. When she turned back to the man, he was gone. The whistling had stopped, and the fog began to lift, revealing the lake's calm surface. That was the last time Sarah saw the whistling man. She never heard the tune again, but she felt a sense of peace she couldn't explain. Whatever had drawn her to the trail, whatever the man had wanted her to see, she felt she had found it, even if she didn't fully understand what it was. Sarah continued to run by the lake, but she always carried the memory of the whistling man with her. For her, he was a reminder of the mysteries that linger just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. The Vanishing Runner. Jake loved running. Every evening after a long day of work, he laced up his running shoes and headed to the local park. It wasn't just the exercise he enjoyed, it was the fresh air, the rustling trees, and the feeling of being free as his feet hit the ground in a steady rhythm. He had a group of friends who joined him regularly: Ryan, Liz, and Marco. They weren't professional runners, but they all loved the camaraderie and the occasional friendly competition. The park they frequented was known for its winding trails and beautiful views. At sunset, the orange and pink hues of the sky reflected on the small lake, making the place look magical. Despite its beauty, the park had an eerie reputation. There were stories about strange sightings and mysterious events, but Jake and his friends never paid much attention to those tales. To them, the park was just a great place to run. One Friday evening, the group met at their usual spot near the park's entrance. The air was cool, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the trail. "How about a race to the hill today?" Ryan suggested, pointing to a small hill about half a mile away. Jake grinned. "You sure you want to lose again?" "We'll see about that," Ryan shot back, laughing. Liz and Marco agreed to the race, and they lined up at the start of the trail. "Ready, set, go," Liz shouted. They all took off. Jake was fast. His long strides quickly put him ahead of the group. The trail twisted and turned, but he moved effortlessly, the wind rushing past his face. He reached the hill in no time and stood at the top, catching his breath. Turning around, he expected to see his friends close behind. But the trail was empty. He waited, hands on his hips, scanning the path below. Minutes passed and still no one appeared. "Where are they?" he muttered to himself. Maybe they had taken a wrong turn or decided to stop for a break. Jake started jogging back down the trail, calling out their names. "Ryan, Liz, Marco, where are you guys?" The park, usually filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, was strangely quiet. The sun had set, and the dim light made the shadows under the trees seem darker. Jake's calls echoed, but there was no response. A chill ran down his spine. As he continued down the path, he suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind him. They were quick and frantic, like someone running for their life. Relieved, Jake turned around, expecting to see his friends. But it wasn't them. Instead, a woman he had never seen before was sprinting toward him. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Her long hair flew wildly behind her, and she wore a bright red jacket that made her stand out against the dark surroundings. "Help me. He's coming," she screamed as she ran past him, her voice trembling with terror. Jake was stunned. "Wait, who's coming?" "What's wrong?" he called after her. But she didn't stop. She disappeared down the trail and into the woods, her figure swallowed by the shadows. Heart pounding, Jake turned to look in the direction she had come from. There was no one there. The trail was empty, silent, except for the sound of his own breathing. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow her. "Miss. Wait, it's not safe to run off like that," he shouted, picking up his pace. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't catch up to her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. After a few minutes, Jake stopped. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. The woods around him felt darker now, the trees looming like silent watchers. He turned back toward the main trail, deciding it was best to find his friends and leave the park. To his relief, he saw them walking toward him, laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. "There you are," Liz said, grinning. "What took you so long?" "Me? What took you guys so long?" "I've been waiting at the hill forever," Jake replied, confused. "We thought you got lost or something," Marco said. "We didn't see you after the start." Jake frowned. "I was at the hill. Didn't you hear me calling you?" They all shook their heads. "Nope," Ryan said. "We didn't hear anything. But you'll never believe this, we heard footsteps behind us. Like someone was running, but no one was there. It was creepy." Jake's heart sank. "I saw someone," he said quietly. His friends stared at him. "What do you mean?" Liz asked. "There was a woman. She ran past me screaming for help. She said someone was chasing her. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I tried to follow her, but she disappeared into the woods." The group fell silent. The cheerful atmosphere vanished, replaced by a heavy unease. "Jake, are you messing with us?" Marco asked, his voice uncertain. "I'm not," Jake said firmly. She was real. She looked terrified. Liz glanced at Ryan and Marco. "Do you think it could be she trailed off?" "Could be what?" Jake asked. Ryan hesitated before answering. "There's a story about a woman who went missing in this park years ago. They say she was last seen wearing a red jacket. Some people claim they've seen her ghost running through the trails." Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. "You think I saw a ghost?" "I don't know," Ryan said. "But it's weird that you saw her and we didn't. And those footsteps we heard." The group decided to leave the park immediately. As they walked back to their cars, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch made them jumpy. When they finally reached the parking lot, they parted ways quickly, each eager to get home. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the encounter in his mind. Who was the woman? What was she running from? And why had she vanished so suddenly? The next day, he decided to do some research. At the library, he found old newspaper articles about the park. Sure enough, there was a story about a woman who had gone missing 5 years ago. Her name was Emily Carter, and she had been an avid runner. The last time anyone saw her, she was wearing a bright red jacket. Despite extensive searches, her body was never found. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the woman he saw was Emily. But what did she mean when she screamed, "He's coming"? Who was she afraid of? And why was she still running after all these years? Determined to find answers, Jake returned to the park the following evening. He walked the trail slowly, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of her. The sun set, and the familiar eerie silence settled over the park. "Emily," he called softly. "If you're here, I want to help you." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, he heard the sound of footsteps. His heart raced as he turned toward the noise. In the distance, he saw a figure in a red jacket, standing at the edge of the trail. She looked at him, her face a mix of fear and desperation. "Help me," she whispered. And then she was gone. Jake stood there, his mind spinning. He didn't know how to help her, but one thing was clear: Emily's story wasn't over, and he was determined to uncover the truth. The Screaming Bridge. Emily loved her evening jogs. They were her time to escape the stress of the day and enjoy the quietness of the outdoors. Her favorite route took her through a peaceful trail in the woods, across a small wooden bridge that stretched over a narrow creek. The bridge was old and worn, its wooden planks groaning underfoot whenever she crossed it. Still, it was the fastest way to complete her loop, and Emily didn't mind its eerie sounds. In fact, she found them almost comforting, a sign that the bridge was holding up, even after all these years. One particular evening, the weather was less than ideal. The sky was gray, and rain had started to drizzle, making the ground slick and the air cold. Emily debated skipping her jog, but her routine was important to her. She threw on her rain jacket, laced up her running shoes, and headed out. The rain added an extra challenge, but she liked pushing herself. She didn't realize, however, that this evening would be unlike any other. As Emily approached the old bridge, the rain picked up, tapping against the wooden planks like tiny drum beats. She could barely see through the mist that was forming over the creek below. The bridge seemed even creakier than usual, each step causing it to groan loudly. But Emily was used to it. She was halfway across when she heard it for the first time: a scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was sharp, piercing, and so sudden that Emily froze mid-step. Her heart raced as she looked around, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. The bridge was empty. The woods around her were silent except for the patter of rain. The creek below, now swollen from the rain, rushed noisily in the darkness. Emily shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. Maybe the wind had howled in a strange way, or maybe an animal had made the noise. She took a deep breath and continued running. But then, the scream came again. This time it was louder and seemed to echo all around her. Emily stopped dead in her tracks. It didn't sound like the wind or an animal. It sounded human, and worse, it sounded like it was coming from directly beneath her. She peered over the edge of the bridge, but the creek was too dark and turbulent to see anything. Fear clawed at her chest. She didn't know what to do. Should she call for help? But who would hear her out here? Panicked, Emily decided to run. She sprinted off the bridge as fast as her legs could carry her, not stopping until she reached the safety of her home. Her clothes were soaked, and her lungs burned from the effort, but she didn't care. The only thing on her mind was the scream. What had she heard? Was someone in danger, or was it something else? Later that night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She told her best friend Sarah about the experience. Sarah listened carefully, her face growing serious. "That's creepy," she said. "But you know, there's a story about that bridge." Emily's curiosity piqued despite her fear. "What kind of story?" she asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Well, a long time ago, a young girl fell off that bridge and drowned in the creek. People say her ghost haunts the bridge. They claim you can hear her screaming, especially on rainy nights. I always thought it was just an old legend, but maybe there's some truth to it." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had always dismissed ghost stories as silly, but now she wasn't so sure. "Do you think it's true?" she whispered. Sarah shrugged. "I don't know, but if I were you, I wouldn't run that route anymore." Emily nodded. She didn't need to be told twice. From that night on, she avoided the bridge entirely, choosing a longer but safer route for her jogs. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had heard. Was it really the ghost of the girl, or was there another explanation? The questions lingered in her mind, but she wasn't brave enough to find out the answers. The history of the bridge. After her frightening experience, Emily became obsessed with the history of the bridge. She started digging into local records and asking older residents about it. What she discovered only deepened the mystery. The bridge had been built over 100 years ago as part of a small trail connecting two farming communities. Over time, the area had become less populated, and the bridge fell into disrepair. But it was still used by joggers, hikers, and the occasional cyclist. Despite its age, no major accidents had been recorded until about 20 years ago, when the tragic incident involving the young girl occurred. According to the stories, the girl, whose name was Lily, had been playing on the bridge with her friends. It had been a rainy day, much like the one Emily experienced. The planks were slippery, and Lily's foot slipped as she leaned over the edge to look at the creek. She fell into the rushing water and was swept away. Her friends ran for help, but by the time rescuers arrived, it was too late. Lily's body was found downstream the next day. The tragedy shook the small community, and the bridge became a place of mourning. Flowers and notes were left there for years in Lily's memory. But as time passed, the story of her death began to fade, replaced by whispers of ghostly sightings and strange noises. People claimed to hear footsteps on the bridge when no one was there, or feel a sudden chill as they crossed it. Some even reported hearing a girl's voice calling for help. Emily's decision. Emily couldn't ignore the stories. The more she learned, the more she felt a strange connection to the bridge and its tragic past. Part of her wanted to stay far away from it, but another part of her felt drawn to it. She needed closure. She needed to know what had happened that night. One evening, after weeks of avoiding the bridge, Emily made a decision. She would return just once to see if she could make sense of what she had heard. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she set out on her usual jogging route. The night was clear, unlike the rainy evening when she had first heard the scream, but as she approached the bridge, she felt the familiar weight of fear settle in her chest. The bridge looked the same as it always had, its wooden planks worn and weathered. Emily hesitated at the edge, her flashlight beam dancing across the creaking boards. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the bridge. At first, everything was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the gentle flow of the creek below. Emily walked slowly, scanning the area with her flashlight. "Is anyone here?" she called out, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing. Then she heard it. A faint, distant sound that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't a scream this time, but a soft cry, like someone sobbing. Emily froze, her heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath the bridge. Gathering her courage, Emily leaned over the edge and shone her flashlight into the darkness below. The beam illuminated the rushing water, but there was nothing else there. "Hello," she called again, her voice shaking. The crying stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Emily felt a surge of fear and turned to leave, but as she did, she felt a sudden gust of cold wind. It was so strong that it nearly knocked her off balance. She stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground. Terrified, Emily grabbed her flashlight and ran, not stopping until she was far from the bridge. When she finally reached home, she was shaking. Whatever she had experienced on the bridge, she didn't want to face it again. A haunting reminder. Despite her fear, Emily couldn't forget what had happened. The bridge had left its mark on her, a chilling reminder of the unknown. She still avoided it on her jogs, but she found herself thinking about it often. Sometimes late at night, she would hear the faint echo of a scream in her dreams, pulling her back to that rainy evening on the bridge. The locals continued to share their stories about the bridge, each one adding to its legend. Some said Lily's ghost was still searching for someone to help her, while others believed she was warning people to stay away. Whatever the truth was, Emily knew one thing for certain: she would never cross that bridge again.